The man next to you has not bathed in 6 weeks. You can tell not because of the smell. You stopped noticing the smell on day 3, but because his beard has collected a visible crust of salt, grease, and something you prefer not to identify. He is asleep, sitting upright, pressed against your left shoulder, his body the only source of warmth you have had since the coast of England disappeared behind you. You are not friends. You will never be friends. But tonight, in the middle of the North Sea in January, his body heat is the difference between sleeping and lying awake, shivering until your teeth crack. This is what it actually meant to sail in the Middle Ages. Not the romantic version, not the maps with sea monsters drawn in the margins, not the heroic navigators pointing at distant horizons. The real version. The version where ordinary men, peasants, laborers, fishermen, pilgrims, and the desperately poor ended up on wooden ships in some of the coldest, most violent water on the planet, armed with almost nothing, and somehow made it to the other side. The question is, how? The ships themselves were not built for comfort. They were built for cargo. The dominant vessel of the 13th and 14th centuries in northern Europe was the cog, a deep-bellied, single-masted merchant ship designed to haul wool, timber, salt, and grain across the Baltic and North Sea trade routes. The Hanseatic League, the enormous commercial network connecting German, Scandinavian, Flemish, and English ports, ran on these ships. And the men who crewed them were not professional sailors in any modern sense. Many were seasonal workers. Agricultural laborers who found winter fieldwork impossible and signed on for a voyage because at least the ship offered wages, however meager, and at least at sea there was no landlord demanding rent. They stepped aboard with almost nothing. A wool tunic, a second wool tunic if they were lucky, a cloak, boots that were often already falling apart. The better-off pilgrims, those sailing from Southampton toward Bordeaux or making the longer journey toward Santiago de Compostela, might have a proper traveling cloak oiled with lanolin, which repelled water with reasonable efficiency. But the ordinary crew? They were wearing whatever they had walked onto the dock in. And then the ship left the harbor, and the cold became a different thing entirely. Anyone who has spent time on open water in winter understands that wind at sea is not the same as wind on land. On land, you can find shelter behind a wall, a tree, a building. On a medieval cog, there is no shelter. The deck is open. The rigging screams. The spray comes over the bow in sheets and soaks through wool in minutes. Wet wool is heavy and miserable and cold, but it does retain some heat even when saturated. This is one of the genuine advantages of wool over linen. And medieval people knew it even if they didn't have the chemistry to explain why. Wool fibers trap tiny pockets of air. Wet wool keeps working. Wet linen is just a cold rag clinging to your body. But wet wool only goes so far when the temperature is hovering near freezing and the wind is pushing 30 knots. The solution to cold at sea was almost entirely communal. You survived by proximity to other bodies. At night, below decks in the cargo hold a cramped, low-ceiling space reeking of bilge, water, saltfish, and mildew. Sailors and passengers slept pressed together in groups. Animal hides were spread on the wooden planking. Men lay in rows with whatever they owned draped over them, legs tangled together, sharing body heat the way dogs do. The hides were often the same ones used to wrap cargo, cow, horse, occasionally bear in the Baltic trade. They stank. Everything stank. But they held heat with remarkable efficiency. And in the middle of a January night in the North Sea, efficiency was the only thing that mattered. There was no fire below decks. This was not a comfort decision. A fire in a wooden ship's hold meant a dead wooden ship. Cooking was done on deck, in a crude firebox built from brick or sand, set into a metal container, usually located midships, where the rocking was least violent. In bad weather, which in the North Sea in winter meant most of the time there was no cooking at all, the fire was too dangerous to maintain when the ship was rolling hard, and so the crew ate cold. What they ate is its own kind of survival story. Hardtack. This is the word that appears over and over in the historical record, though medieval sailors would have called it ship's biscuit, or simply biscuit, from the Latin bis coctus, twice baked. Flour and water baked until almost completely dry, then baked again until even the moisture that remained in the first bake was driven out. The result was a dense, pale, nearly indestructible disk that could last months at sea without spoiling because there was almost nothing in it for bacteria to consume. It had no fat, no salt in many versions. It had almost no flavor whatsoever. It was calorie delivery in its purest, most depressing form. Eating hardtack in winter presented an additional problem. It was so dry and so hard that cold hands couldn't easily break it. Sailors soaked it in whatever liquid was available. Salt pork broth when there had been cooking, ale, sometimes seawater in desperation, which made the thirst worse and solved nothing. The soaking also served another purpose that nobody liked to discuss. It surfaced the weevils. Hardtack, stored for any length of time, became inhabited. There is an old sailor's practice, documented from the medieval period onward, of tapping the biscuit on something hard before eating it in the dark, to encourage the weevils to leave before you put the biscuit in your mouth. In daylight, many simply ate around them. In genuine hunger, they didn't bother trying. Salt pork and dried saltfish completed the basic medieval sailor's diet. The fish stockfish, usually cod dried on wooden racks in Scandinavian cold air, or herring packed in barrels of salt, was the caloric backbone of the northern European maritime world. It didn't need refrigeration. It lasted almost indefinitely if kept dry. It was loaded onto ships by the barrel and the ton. It was also, after 6 weeks, a flavor so deeply embedded in everything around you that you stopped tasting it and simply experienced it as an ambient condition of existence. Dried peas and beans appeared in the historical ship's provisions records. They could be boiled into a thick, warming stew on days when cooking was possible. And a bowl of hot peas porridge in the middle of a cold crossing was not a trivial thing. It was, quite literally, the most warmth a working sailor was going to feel that day. The heat of the bowl in your hands. The steam on your face. That counted. That mattered in a way that is difficult to overstate when the rest of your day is spent soaking wet and shaking. Ale was everywhere, and its role was not primarily recreational. Medieval ale was lower in alcohol than modern beer, typically 1 to 3%, but it was caloric, it was warm when heated, and it was safe to drink in a way that water stored in barrels on a wooden ship absolutely was not. Water in barrels turned green and slimy within days. It developed a taste that sailors described consistently as the worst thing they had ever put in their mouths. The ale was bad too, but it was a different kind of bad. The watches were the cruelest part. A medieval ship under sail required constant attention. The helmsman at the stern, men watching the rigging for signs of tearing or tangling, lookouts watching for rocks, shoals, other ships, ice. The ship did not sleep, and so the crew could not all sleep at once. Watches were typically divided into 2 shifts of 4 hours each, rotating through the crew. In summer, a 4-hour night watch was inconvenient. In winter, at night, in the North Sea, a 4-hour watch was a test of endurance that some men failed. Frostbite records from the medieval period are sparse but present. The extremities went first fingers, toes, ears, the tip of the nose. Sailors rubbed animal fat tallow, lard, whale oil when it was available into their exposed skin before going on deck at night. This created an insulating layer against the wind and spray and slowed the rate at which flesh lost heat. It was the same principle behind the fat that channel swimmers use today, just without any of the science behind it. Medieval sailors knew it worked because they had watched men who didn't do it lose fingers, and they were very interested in keeping their fingers. Men on night watch developed small rituals for keeping the cold manageable. Constant movement, not dramatic movement, but deliberate, rhythmic stamping of the feet, rolling the shoulders, curling and uncurling fingers inside their sleeves. Experienced sailors knew that stillness in cold air was the beginning of a serious problem. You kept moving even when there was nothing to do, even when the ship was running clean and the night was quiet. Some men sang under their breath, not for comfort in any sentimental sense, but because the act of producing sound requires the chest to work, and a working chest is a warm chest. Short, repetitive fragments of song, the same line repeated until it stopped having meaning. There are accounts from later centuries of sailors singing themselves through night watches almost unconsciously, the melody becoming indistinguishable from the sound of the rigging. The medieval period left fewer written records of this, but the logic and the need were identical. Rope work in cold temperatures is its own particular agony. Ropes stiffen. Knots that you can tie in 30 seconds in July take 3 minutes in January with numb hands, and if you make a mistake, if a line runs free at the wrong moment, men die. The rigging killed sailors regularly, even in good conditions. In winter, in the dark, with frozen fingers and a heaving deck under your feet, the margin for error was almost nothing. Some men fell overboard. The water temperature in the North Sea in January is typically between 4 and 6 degrees Celsius. Without a wetsuit, without modern understanding of cold water shock, a man who went overboard in those temperatures had perhaps 10 minutes before his muscles stopped working well enough to keep him at the surface. The ship rarely turned back in time. This was understood by everyone on board. It was one of the known conditions of the work, filed alongside the hardtack and the weevils and the smell, accepted as part of what you had agreed to when you walked up the gangplank. Illness spread on medieval ships with an efficiency that the cold both helped and hurt. The cold suppressed some pathogens, but the crowding negated that advantage entirely. Men sleeping pressed together in the hold, sharing breath in a closed space, meant that any respiratory infection that came aboard in one body was in every body within a week. The medieval understanding of contagion was limited miasma theory, bad air, divine punishment, but sailors had a practical, empirical knowledge that sick men needed to be kept away from the rest. Quarantine before the word existed. The sick man was moved to a separate corner of the hold, given his own drinking vessel, told to keep his coughs to himself. It didn't always work. It worked sometimes. Scurvy was a winter ship problem in a way that summer voyaging obscured. Fresh fruit and vegetables disappeared from the diet on long voyages, and with them went the vitamin C that holds human connective tissue together. The symptoms of scurvy are gruesome gums that bleed and swell, teeth that loosen in their sockets, old wounds that reopen as collagen breaks down, a bone-deep exhaustion that makes the simple act of pulling on a rope feel like lifting stone. Medieval sailors did not understand vitamin C. They didn't have that framework. But they knew that men who ate onions and certain grains stayed healthier on long voyages, and the records of provisioning from Hanseatic ports show dried onions appearing on ship inventories regularly. Folk knowledge. Centuries of watching men die, and a practical decision to load the onions. The knowledge was never written down as medicine. It was written down as habit, as routine, as the way things were done, which meant it survived in practice long after everyone who first figured it out had been forgotten. The Pilgrims are a particular case within this larger story. The traffic in medieval religious pilgrimage was enormous, and a significant portion of it moved by sea. Pilgrims sailing from English ports to Santiago de Compostela in Spain, or from Venetian ports toward the Holy Land, were paying passengers on merchant vessels, not crew, but sharing the same exposure. And the accounts they left are vivid, in a way that formal ship records are not, because pilgrims wrote about their feelings. William Way, an English pilgrim who sailed to the Holy Land in the 15th century, left detailed notes about what to bring: a thick cloak, extra wool stockings, a chamber pot, because getting from below decks to the rail in a storm at night was a journey many preferred not to make. Ginger, he advised, to settle the stomach, a cap that covered the ears. His notes have the quality of a man who has learned everything he knows through personal suffering and is now, charitably, trying to prevent strangers from suffering the same way. Seasickness in cold weather is uniquely awful. The motion of the ship, the smell of the hold, the food that doesn't stay down, and while you are retching over the side of the deck, you are also being soaked with freezing spray, and every muscle contraction from vomiting drives more heat out of your core. The Pilgrim accounts describe men lying in the hold, unable to move for days at a time. The crew stepped around them. Experienced sailors had a profound contempt for seasick passengers, and they were not gentle about expressing it. And yet the Pilgrims kept coming. Every sailing season, thousands of them, merchants, priests, minor nobility, ordinary people who had made a vow, or who were desperate, or who simply believed the journey was worth it, lined up at the docks of Southampton and Bristol and Genoa and Marseille, and stepped onto ships knowing that several weeks of Dachab, this awaited them. Faith is the word that gets applied to that decision, and it is probably correct. But desperation and a kind of magnificent stubbornness are also in there somewhere. What kept people going, when the rational calculation said this was insane, was a combination of things that had nothing to do with comfort. Routine was one. The watches, the meals, the sail adjustments, even when the cold made everything difficult, the structure of shipboard life gave the day shape. Medieval sailors were not given to introspection in the written record, but the behavioral logic is visible. Men who had tasks survived better than men who did not. Having something to do with your hands, even numb hands, was a form of psychological anchor. Superstition and prayer were another anchor, and in the medieval world, there was no clean line between the two. Men carried relics. A small bone, a sealed scrap of parchment with a saint's name, a carved wooden cross worn smooth from handling. These were not passive objects. They were worked, rubbed, pressed, held against the chest during storms the way you would hold something that could hear you. The church had specific prayers for those at sea. Some sailors had them memorized and said them quietly at the start of every watch, not as performance, but as procedure, the same way you rub tallow into your knuckles, a practical protection. The storms didn't care, but the men who said the prayers slept marginally better afterward, and sleep on a cold ship is its own form of survival. Noise was another. Ships are not silent. The creak of the timber, the singing of the rigging, the slap of water on the hull, these sounds were constant, and long voyage sailors report a version of this even in the modern era. The silence of the marina feels wrong after weeks at sea. The ship sounds become a form of companionship, an indicator. A healthy ship made certain sounds. All. A ship in trouble sounded different, and experienced ears knew the difference before any visible sign appeared. And then there was the simple, irreducible fact that these men were not soft, not by modern standards, and arguably not by the standards of any era. The men who crewed Hanseatic cogs across the Baltic in February had survived childhoods of cold and hunger and seasonal hardship that make the crossing seem like an extension of something already familiar. The peasant laborer who signed on as crew in winter had probably already spent 20 winters sleeping in poorly insulated buildings, eating inadequate food, working in fields where the wind came straight off the water with nothing between it and your face. The ship was cold, the ship was wet, the ship was terrifying in a storm. But it was not, for many of these men, qualitatively different from the life they had lived on land. That is, perhaps, the most important historical fact in this entire story. Medieval peasant cold weather survival at sea was not a special category of toughness. It was just toughness. The normal, daily, unrecorded toughness of bodies that had never been given any other option. There is a ship preserved in Bremen, Germany, the Bremen Cog, pulled from the river sediment in 1962, dated to around 1,380. You can stand next to it in the museum and look at its dimensions. It is not a small ship by medieval standards, but by modern ones, it is startlingly compact. Imagine everything described above: the crew of 15 to 20 men, the barrels of salt fish, the hardtack, the animal hides, the tallow jars packed into that space. Imagine January. Imagine the North Sea. Imagine the man sleeping against your shoulder. And then consider this. Some of those men made that crossing multiple times in a single year. Not because anyone forced them, not because they didn't understand what they were signing up for, but because the wages were needed, or the journey mattered, or because they had simply decided that the cold was something you moved through rather than something that stopped you. The crossing was brutal, the ship was brutal, the winter was brutal. They went anyway. And on the other side of the water, somewhere, there was a dock and a fire and a bowl of something hot, and the solid feeling of ground that didn't move, and that was enough to make the whole miserable crossing worth it. The strange thing is, most of us know exactly what that feels like. The terrible thing you endure in full knowledge that it is terrible, because what's waiting on the other side is worth every minute of the cold. Some things about being human have not changed at all.